Hello, and welcome to the Blues Kind Show, the show for kind blues. Given that we have our first of two buys this season, I thought it would be a good opportunity for me to go back through the last couple of seasons and look out when did the second half fade outs actually begin. It's something that people talk about a lot, but and I've heard a few different theories and dates nominated. But I'm not all that convinced with what I've heard, so I thought it might be a good opportunity for me to go back and revisit a few things and see if we can come up with something more conclusive. Before we get into it, there's a couple of things that I want to say. The firstly is, this will not be a short video. I'm sure you'll see the timestamp ahead of time. I would encourage you to take a break halfway through. There will actually be an intermission, if you don't want to bite this video off in one go. But for all those who do it, firstly, legend. Secondly, legend. So, additionally, I just want to thank everyone who has subscribed and been commenting on my most recent videos. I've even got some emails in the last couple of weeks from fans, so yeah, it really buoys me and makes me feel really, really good about what we're doing here and the type of community that we're creating. So yeah, thanks everyone who's wanted to get on board. If you haven't subscribed, please subscribe on up. And the last thing that I want to touch on before sort of launching in is I normally don't ask this. For people who have been watching me for a while, I think you could recall I've never made this request of people that are watching along at home, but I put a bucket load of effort into this video. So if you like what I'm doing and if you think what I'm saying is valid, please share it around. I normally don't ask. I put a heap of research into it. So if you think what I'm saying is compelling, please share it around. It'll obviously help the video, but who knows? It might change a couple of people's minds. So I think we can all agree that the Carlton Football Club on field presently has an issue of fading out in the second half of games. However, there is disagreement on not just what causes these fade outs, but also where do the fade outs begin. It's hard to know exact reasons, so anyone who is saying they know exactly why it's happening probably don't buy any bridges that they're trying to sell you. But what we can do is look at some data and see if we can identify any trends or reasons as to why the fade outs occur. Particularly, I think that I've done a reasonable job of identifying maybe where this trend commenced. But we'll see if you're convinced by what I've got to say. Now, why I wanted to do this. I've heard a lot of people pointing to different points in time as to when these issues started. Some people have said mid-2024. I didn't agree with this just because I think that it obviously started earlier. It's not that it didn't maybe reoccur during this time, but I think it's a bit of a misdiagnosis. Some people, and by this I mean one very loud person, said that it started in late 2022. I'll expand on this later, but I didn't agree with this take, again because I thought it probably started earlier. Before commencing the video, my estimation was 2020 to 2021, someone in there. And it's because you might remember there was a lot of discussion around Carlton conceding runs of 5 goals or more, and I thought it commenced during that time, which would obviously be evidence of large swings in momentum, but I didn't know what the real date was, so I've given myself a bit of leeway. But given this is my theory, and my theory about why these fade outs occur, as I said in a previous video, were that they were mentally driven, I thought that it could be linked to the past, but not so far back as prior to this period, with obviously some people even saying that it occurred earlier than 2020 to 2021. I personally think that it's too far back to be able to make, to draw a causal link, but we'll obviously get into it today. So, what I wanted to go over before we get too much further is a little bit of the method that I undertook here. As with all of my videos, they're gonna involve me fiddling around with graphics as we go, so I apologize in advance. Again, if anyone knows a good producer or editor, even if they can just teach me how to do this stuff better, please put it in the comments or send me an email. But in the meantime, I'm really hoping that I can demonstrate my message with the tools that I have available. So, I made the data that I went on to use for my review by manually going back through every game that we played from 2016 to 2025. I didn't include 2026 because we can all agree that in the first two games of the season, we had a second half fade out or collapse, whatever phrasing you want to use. Believe it or not, there was no website where I could readily find the data that I wanted to use. And what I wanted to have was just knowing the halftime margin, the end of game margin, and then doing a simple subtraction to see if there was a noticeable fall off in our margins between first and second halves of games. I thought this was while not a perfect way to assess whether or not we are in fact having fade outs in second halves of football games. We can all agree that we are. It did a good job to be able to capture enough games for me to be able to review season by season. Obviously, getting a full set of data that shows what the biggest margin was in any given game with the timestamp would have been a lot more laborious. But, and this is most specific, the allegation that Carlton has suffered from is that we experience second half fade outs. So I think while my approach could be improved upon, it's actually quite effective at demonstrating the second half issues that we have experienced, depending on how you set the margins of what is considered a fade out or a collapse or whatever else. Before I go on to continue to explain, this table will come up again, and I just wanted to quickly go through what it represents. So obviously in the farthest left column, we have the seasons, followed by the number of games played in each year. Then in the top table, we have the number of 12-point collapses, my terminology, and in the bottom table, 18-point collapses. I thought it was worth reviewing how many times we had a second half where the margin decreased by 12 or more points, as well as 18 or more points, just to give us more frames of reference to sort of see if there was consistency depending on where I set my benchmark. I have then taken the number of games in which these collapses have occurred and categorized them into one of three subcategories. Either games where margins eased out or were blown out. These are games where we didn't have the lead at half time, but the margin increased against us by 12 or 18 points respectively. So for example, in 2025, there was 3 games when we were not ahead at half time, but the margin continued to blow out by, or ease out or blow out, however you want to think about it, by more than 12 points than the first half margin, than the halftime margin. The second subcategory is fade outs, which resulted in either a loss or a draw. I had to put draws in because there was one time where it occurred, but for all intents and purposes, they're losses, with the exception of one data point. These were games when we were in front at halftime and then experienced a collapse of 12 or 18 points, depending on which table, in the second half, resulting in a loss or, in one instance, a draw. And then finally, there is the fade out win category. These are games where we were up at halftime. We surrendered a lot of our lead, but we still hung on to win the game overall. Finally, the last column is just the percentage of games with a 12 or 18 point collapse respectively in that given season. So I've just noticed an error. In the top, I've represented the values as percentages. In the second, I've represented them as decimals. For those who aren't as handy at maths, for the second table, all you need to do is ignore the 0 and the decimal place at the start, and that is the percentage. So for 2025, the percentage is 39. For 2024, 17%, etc., etc. how I wanted to try to assess things was by seeing whether or not there was a trend in our differentials between halftime and full-time margins per game over the last decade. How I did this was to look at the data filtered based on how much worse our second half margins were when compared to our first half margins. I thought two good yardsticks were a 12-point decrease in margin and 18-point decrease in margin between half-time and full-time. I initially liked 12 because it allowed me to get a large sample of games that would give me a good idea of, maybe where I could start looking for trends. And then when I actually expanded out to 18-point decreases in margin between half and full time, what I noticed was that a lot of the same trends still existed. So it gave me a lot of confidence. However, what I wanted to do was point out the last three games that I've shown in this graphic for 2025, as they quite neatly show the three subcategories that I'd be using. The first is fade out, loss or draw. That can be seen in the Sydney game, the third last game on the graphic, because at halftime we're up by 7, full-time we were down by 16. So we faded out and went on to lose. The next game was a game in which the margin either eased or blew out, depending on how you look at a 28-point loss overall. Or at least an 18-point second half worse performance than the first half in terms of margin, where we were down by 10 and went on to be down by 28 overall. The final subcategory is where we experienced a fade out but went on to win. So halftime against Essendon, we were up by 28, but we held on to win by 8 points. For anyone who remembers that Essendon game from last year, much more stressful than it needed to be. So because I thought that a 12-point swing between two halves might be a bit too sensitive, I tried the data again with an 18-point swing. I'll discuss the differences between these two as we go on, but right now I'm just trying to introduce you to the approach. Additionally, I'm not going to show the whole data set in this video because there's over 200 games and it might be a bit hard to follow, but I'll put a link in the description so you can go and see, the web version of that document. Firstly, I wanted to acknowledge that every single team in the league will have instances where they go, where they have 12 and 18-point collapses from the first half when compared to the second half. There needs to be an allowable limit, given it's something all teams would experience. This is especially the case given that my method can't capture everything perfectly. There will be examples where I don't think it's captured everything perfectly, and I'll try to disclose them later just for the sake of transparency. Merely having games where a 12 or 18-point collapse occurred isn't an issue. The issue is when it becomes a trend. So, like I mentioned, I went back to 2016 and 17. And while there was some indication, due to issues like, a vastly different playing list and it being too long ago, like 2016 was Jacob Wiedering, Harry Mackay, Charlie Curnow, Jack Silvani's first season at the club, I thought, while there are some similarities, it is probably too early. And you could say the same for 17, but ultimately, we just weren't that good of a team. And speaking of when we were not a very good team, let's start in 2018. Going back through this data, starting with 2018, this was a year where we came last and gosh knows we played like it. 12 games included an 18-point second half collapse, with 8 of them coming through margin blowouts, meaning we were down and the margin got worse, but only 4 of the 12 where we were in front and went on to lose. What this screamed to me was we were just a bad team. No great shocker given I think we won 2 games that year. Therefore, while some scarring might have began in this season, it was only the 3rd season for players like Wiedering, Harry, Charlie, etc. So I think we can just put this down to us being a bad team. The collapses in question can all be seen highlighted in yellow, and especially at the back end of the year, you're seeing a lot of games where we were just flatly never in these games, and it wasn't us fading out or struggling with maintaining competitiveness because of the pressure of the game. We just got ran over because we weren't very good. So I think the less said about this very depressing time, the better. So I'm more than happy to move on to 2019. After an unceremonious 2018, Brendan Bolton was on a short leash at the start of 2019. After starting the season 1-10, as you can see from the full-time margin column, the second last, there is only one positive game, up until round 12, with it coming against the Bulldogs. Starting 1-10 and going down to Essendon specifically resulted in Brendan Bolton getting sacked. This meant that David Teague was elevated to caretaker coach. And I think we all remember this meme. The Teague train would then take us to a greatly improved 6 wins and 5 losses through our last 11 games when compared to 1-10. That's a huge improvement. With the support of many Carlton people, including the players, requesting that the Teague train stay on and formally be made Carlton coach for the 2020 season. In terms of my exercise, I thought that this info was really notable because in 2019 we had 5 12-point second half collapses, 4 of which were also 18-point collapses. Of the 18-point collapses, all of them occurred at the start of the season under Brendan Bolton. So at this time, it seemed that Teague, who came in with his first game being against Brisbane in round 12, it seemed that Teague may have fixed what ailed us. There was only one 12-point second half collapse in his 11 games, and that came against a Geelong team that would go on to finish on top of the ladder at the end of the home and away season. So I would say that, all signs still pointed to positive. So if you wanted to say that our second half fade out started this far back, I don't think the information is there to confirm that that is definitely the case. But what I think you could say is that it is fair to say that during 2018 and early 2019, the issues first commenced. I think in reality, we just got blown out a bunch of times in 2018 because we weren't good enough. It wasn't fumbling winnable games so much during 2018, but at the start of 2019, it did sort of seem that was in fact starting to become the case before the ship got righted during David Teague's stint as caretaker. But I don't think this is when the specific issues that we are talking about, that being second half fade outs, really commenced. I think that just some of the scarring that would lead to the issues did commence at this time. 2020 was an interesting season because there was only 17 games, each one mattering more as a result. And while we had the same number of second half collapses in 2019 as we did in 2020, given there was 5 fewer games, I think it tells a bit more of a story. The season started quite well, going 4-4 through our first 8 games with only one collapse of over 12 points. And again, that was against Geelong in a game that we would actually end up winning. For those who remember, it was down at the Cattery during COVID in the middle of a lockdown in Melbourne. However, through the last 9 games, it was a very different story. Instead of going 50-50, we would go 3-6, including 6 collapses, all of which were by 18 points or more, including to Collingwood and GWS, who would finish 7th and 11th respectively on the ladder. So 2 of our big collapses came against teams that would finish in a similar place to us on the ladder. Collingwood finished 7th, GWS were 11th, we finished 10th. So in both games, we were in front at half-time before blowing the lead. If we had won both of those games, though, we would still have missed the finals, as We were 2.5 games, not 2 games, behind the team that would end up coming 8th. But I do think it's a good indicator that the trend is starting to develop, although it's not quite there yet. In 2021, in my own notes, I've just titled this one as 2021. Oh no. As you can see by all of the yellow commencing in round 28 in earnest, this is where I believe it all began to go a bit wrong for us, unfortunately. 22 games, 11 12-point collapses after halftime. 6 of them were 18-point collapses. Interestingly, there's a large discrepancy between these two differing levels of second half collapses, but they are entirely captured in 2 categories that are probably the least concerning and therefore go the most overlooked. There was a differential of 4 due to what I've referred to as margin blowouts, meaning we started behind and then lost by even more. So the first Richmond game is a good example of an instance that is captured in the 12-point margin, but not the 18-point margin, because obviously we were only outscored by 14 in that second half. In addition to that, there was also a fade out where we still won, which accounts for a differential of 1. This means that all fade out losses or draws, in other words, every single time that we had the lead and then went on to lose, were by at least 12 points. All of the other instances were either games where we were down and then just went on to get pumped, or we were in front and then held the lead in the end. But we're starting to see the trend developing of giving up decent sized leads and going on to lose. Through the first 7 weeks, we only experienced 1 second half collapse, and it was by 14 points to the reigning premiers when we were already behind. However, we were still 3 wins, 4 losses through the start of the season, where finals were expected. I remember this year really, really clearly. David Teague was basically told, if you don't make finals this year, you will get sacked despite having a year to go on your contract. And you could see that the pressure was starting to mount up. This was the period where Carlton was a much more volatile team, with articles such as Michael Gleeson's from 2021 discussing the issue of conceding a large number of goals in a row. The article is titled "The Troubling Stats Behind Carlton's Fade Outs," and I'll put the link in the description. The screen grab here is from the article, and it states that Carlton's capitulation to the Western Bulldogs on Sunday was the 18th time during David Teague's tenure that the Blues have conceded 5 or more unanswered goals. In that time, since round 12 of 2019 to now, only Essendon has seen sides pile on more unanswered runs of goals, in more games. 20 times in the same period. Okay, that's just a shot at Essendon, but it's a bit of fun, isn't it? It's unclear if by David Teague's tenure... actually, no, never mind. So, he said it's the 18th time it occurred during David Teague's tenure. To that point in time, David Teague's tenure included 36 games. So in half the games, there was a run of 5 goals or more against Carlton. In half of the games. But, as we can see, despite half the games including such a large run of goals against us, we didn't necessarily lose all of the games. We didn't even necessarily collapse or fade out, given in the second halves. Given in a lot of games, we were still not outscored by even as many as 12 points in the second half. This is why I always thought the run of goals argument from the time was a little bit weak, because as long as you then have your own run of goals, these swings in momentum sort of balanced out. During 2020, for the most part, they did. We were still underperforming, and the second half fade-outs were creeping in at the end of 2020, but it wasn't a full-blown problem just yet. But as Michael Gleason's reporting was prescient too, with this Bulldogs game that we can see here, where we were up by 12 and went on to lose by 16, Carlton would go on to then have 10 more second half collapses of 12 points, 5 of which were collapses by 18 points or more throughout the rest of the season, from round 8 onwards. Barring one fade-out win that occurred during this period, this represented 5 games where the margin either blew or eased out by 12 points or more, or 5 games where we were in front and went on to lose. In a 15-week period, this resulted in David T getting sacked because it represented 2 out of 3 games on average during that period, that level of a collapse occurring. What I wanted to do before we kept going, though, was a little bit of a score check based on how I started the video. When I started this exercise, it was to see which of the prevailing theories were correct with regard to when our second half fade-out issue commenced. The options were mid-2024 and late 2022. I obviously haven't got to either of those two just yet as we go through the chronology. My guess was sometime under David Teague, and some people said earlier. If you said prior to David Teague, I think you could make an argument. 2018 is not a bad starting point given how cataclysmically that year went, especially in terms of getting blown out repeatedly. But I don't think it's conclusive that it was specifically second half fade-outs that were dogging us in that season. If you said under David Teague, like I did, you can give yourself a half mark. Full marks, though, if at home you said specifically 2021. I didn't pick that, but, it largely resonates with where I thought we would be. The fun bit for me, though, is if you said in 2022 specifically, or even as recently as 2024. I don't really think that those arguments could have a leg to stand on. This issue was clearly apparent by 2021, and just to show that there is a clear connection between 2021 and now, I decided to go through our playing list from 2021 and see who is still there in 2025. Once again, I just want to reiterate, I didn't capture 2026 because firstly, we can all agree that there's been blowouts in the first 2 games, but also because I'm of the belief that we have made so many changes between 25 and 2026 that they deserve an opportunity to see if the changes will lead to a different trend. So, players that were there in 2021 and in 2025. Jack Silvani, Zach Williams, Lockie Fogarty, Patrick Cripps, Harry Mackay, Mitch McGovern, Tom De Koning, Sam Doherty, who was co-captain that year, just in case you're wondering. Brodie Kemp, Sam Walsh, Jacob Wiedering, Nick Newman, Mark Pittonet, Corey Durden, Charlie Curnow, Adam Sard, Jordan Boyd and Matt Cottrell. This isn't to put the blame on these players specifically, but that's 18 guys from the 2021 list who are still on a 2025 list, and most of them are either best 23 or close enough to it. In other words, those 18 guys, most of them are the guys that appear in, pretty much every game from 2021 until the end of my review in 2025. I bring this up not to have a go at any of these guys specifically, but it's more to show the consistency in the teams that were selected during this period to see if you could make a link between 2021 and 2025. To do the same exercise for 2018 to 2025, if you think that it started earlier, you get Jack Silvani, Cripper, Harry, Tom De Koning, Doherty, Wieders, Charlie. This is only 7 guys, so maybe not as strong of a connection, which is why I think 2021 is the time where the line should be drawn. This is why if you In addition to that, if you wanted to make a causal link from 2018, I think it is made difficult by the fact that we were just a bad team. So, of course, you're going to have a lot of fade outs, blowouts, collapses, whatever name you want to give them. While we are not yet done, I feel very confident at this point in saying, while the rumbling of issues may have started earlier, it set in with full effect in 2021, with both the runs to the finals in 2020 and 2021 showing consistent propensities to collapse in second halves, resulting in both blowouts and fade outs that cost us games. Let's get back on track though with 2022. This was Michael Voss's first season at the club, and what I think is interesting is that this was the season where not cashing in at the season's end hurt us, but not for the reasons why I think a lot of people expect. We had 8 games out of the 22 with a second half collapse of 12 points, 5 of which were by 18. So 22 games, 12... Oh, wait, that can't be right. Sorry, 22 games, 8 of which involved a 12-point collapse, 5 of which was an 18 or more point collapse. However, most people, I think from my own recollection, think these games occurred down the stretch. When you look at the numbers next to my head though, I don't think that is the case at all. The graphic shows that through the first 10 games of the season, 6 of the 12-point collapses occurred. That's 6 out of 8. With 4 of 5 of the 18-point collapses occurring. However, as you can tell by looking at the full-time margin column, the interesting thing with these games is that we actually won most of them. The Bulldogs, Hawks, Port and Sydney, in all of them, we coughed up a decent lead that would have caused us to lose, but we hung on despite coughing up the leads. This to me hid the fact that we were still having issues with second half fade outs that, like I mentioned, were in full effect the year prior. I remember watching these games and hearing commentators saying things like, for a young team like Carlton who's just trying to make finals, take the 4 points and move on. I think that was largely the view of the time in 2022, especially early in the season. And while it's fair, it probably hit an issue that would later plague us. The part of the season most people remember is the end, where in the last 4 games, we could have or should have, 2 words I'm not a big fan of, won those games, but we didn't for various reasons. We went to Adelaide, and despite being in the game at half time, we would go on to let go of the rope and lose summarily. The Lions comfortably accounted for us. I believe they were a top 4 team that year, so, fair enough. I also think that game was up there. I should have checked that, but not a huge deal, frankly. The D's we were in the game all day but couldn't get over the line. They were top 4 that year after having won the flag the year before. And finally, Collingwood. This was the year where they came fourth, winning 16 games with an awful percentage of 104 because they kept winning right at the death. This was an interesting game because I think people would count this as a game that we collapsed in, even though, as you can see from my numbers, by my metric, we didn't. We were down by 19 at halftime, and then we only lost by 1. This is where the way that I've captured the stats doesn't necessarily tell the entire story. We were down at halftime, by 19. That is correct. But we would kick 8 goals to 1 in the third quarter to secure a 24-point lead going into the last quarter before coughing up the lead and losing by 1. Firstly, I'm sorry for bringing up this game. I know it's awful, but we need to talk about things like this. Secondly, did we gag it? Obviously. But I don't think this is the sort of collapse that we are now suffering from. That second half lapse where we completely go into our shells. Why do I say that with such confidence? Because in the third quarter, we outscored them by 7 goals. It was clearly a back and forth game, not the sort of collapse we've been dealing with of late, where after half time, the momentum goes one direction. And if we can hold on, then great, but we probably can't. And I also think, as well as some earlier games from this season, despite forfeiting momentum quite easily, we used to be able to get it back. So yeah, while we conceded a bunch of goals in the second and fourth quarter, we also had our own massive run of goals in the third. So look, if you wanted to include the Collingwood game as one of the collapses, I think that that's fair. For the purpose of the exercise as I'm completing it, I am not including it because to me, it's about finding those sorts of games where we just forfeit momentum altogether. Not a game like this where we forfeited momentum but got it back and then at the death we lost it again. That to me is not quite what we're necessarily looking at. But I do want to be clear. If you think that that is a collapse, I'm definitely not going to argue with you. So why did I bring 2022 up? It is because of the round 20 game against Adelaide, where one Sam McClure will directly state this was the game where Carlton's issues began. Before I launch, I want to be really clear. I have taken this from a clip from his Tradies podcast. He does not specifically state that fade-outs began in this game. He does say that all of our issues did though, and if this doesn't extend to the fade-outs, then I'm not sure what else he could be referring to. Even if you want to be generous and say that it's issues that Sam McClure often goes on about with regard to things like lack of standards or lack of ruthlessness, these ideas would obviously contribute to second half collapses. So I think that his statement that I'll cover in a second, that the club was never the same after this game against Adelaide, would have to encompass the issue of halftime fade-outs. If anyone wants to disagree with me, please put it in the comments, but I think that the logic is reasonably sound. I want to re-stress, in the clip that I am referring to and in other media, he has not specifically said the fade-outs, but he has said our issues, as vague as that is, commenced largely due to this game in Adelaide. As quoted in an article by Ben Cotton that I will also link in the description, McClure said, "There must be a misprint in the Carlton teams and one of the emergencies named. I'm flabbergasted." This is with reference to the fact that Jack Silvagni got dropped before this Adelaide game. McClure goes on to say, "I think he's in their best 6 players and he plays every position. More than that, he's a heart and soul player." We can all agree that that quote has not aged very well, but I think even at the time the first half of it was ridiculously on the nose by stating that Jack Silvagni was in our best 6 players. Before addressing the specific take as to how highly Jack ranked and whether or not he was in our best 6 players at the time, I wanted just to continue to read from Ben Cotton's article because it shows the reactions of other football people at the time. Jared Healy says that the dropping of Jack Silvagni showed the brutality of the game, but it is more reflective of the Blues' positional needs. He says, "I feel for Jack. He's had a heck of a year and he's done a great job when Carlton needed him, but it's a brutal sport and they're going to play 3 talls and he, meaning Jack, is a hybrid." Lee Montagna referred to Silvagni as unlucky, but said he understood the move from a structural perspective in Carlton, unleashing the 3-headed monster, as Lee Montagna said. "Geez, if you thought the competition was concerned about Mackay and Curnow, now you've got De Koning sitting on heads and floating around there as well. It's going to be scary. It's a real X factor for the Blues." Nick Rewalt also said it's perfect for Michael Voss to be able to sharpen the focus of the group. When a heart and soul player like Silvagni, who tries every week, gets dropped, it reverberates through the group. You almost get an organic lift and accountability from within the group from having to drop a player just from a selection point of view. And I think that roughly covers off what we wanted to look at. So, with all of that said, we'll now address whether or not Jack was actually in our best 6 players at the time. I thought that take was insane, so I decided to go back and have a quick look at our BNF from that year. Not that BNFs are always perfect in recording who had the best season, but just to see if there's a reasonable argument to make that Jack Silvani is in our best 6. Cripps won the Brownlow that year, as well as the BNF, so I think we can just go right ahead and assume he was better than Jack. Doherty, co-captain, came second, obviously. Sam Walsh, think he made All-Australian that year or the next year. But again, I think we can all agree that Sam Walsh and then Charlie Curnow at the time, especially because Charlie won a Coleman that year, were all clearly better than Jack. George Hewitt, it was his first season at the club. If you don't want to say he was better than Jack yet, I do, but I'm happy just to leave him out for now. You could go to Adam Sard, who made All-Australian. Harry Mackay kicked a lazy 45 goals from 19 games, and Adam Chera actually played 2 fewer games than Jack that season and still did better than him in our BNF. I have named 7 players that I think were better than Jack unequivocally. You can argue the rest, but to say that he's in our best 6 to me is an utter nonsense. I could probably keep digging, but I don't think I need to. McClure, though, wouldn't let this view go, posting to his podcast via their Instagram channel on the 14th of May a clip that I'm going to share in the description. I'm not going to play the clip now for a variety of reasons, mainly just because I don't want to risk getting into any trouble via fair use related stuff, but I will quote some of the things that he said, and you can go and watch it for yourself to see that, I haven't misrepresented what he said. McClure said, round 2022 is the game that changed everything at Carlton, that everything was never the same after this point, and that Jack Silvani was the most valuable player on the list in 2022. He also said, and I thought this was just funny, that Jack Silvani is surprisingly quick. I've never noticed that pace, but, is what it is. This wasn't the only time between 2022 and 2025 where Sam would say things about this specific Adelaide, the dropping of Jack Silvani, and trying to make the causal link between the devolution of the club and that time. But we're not here to litigate nonsense with relation to Jack Silvani. We're here to talk about round 2022, and to see if this was the point that changed everything for our side. I would say, obviously not. Just before I go back to the actual analysis, I just want to say Jack Silvani ended up playing in that Adelaide game. He was brought in late as the sub, and then there was an injury in the first quarter that resulted him going on. I can't remember if it was late in the first or early in the second. He played about 3 quarters. Don't really think that it made that much of a difference for us. As shown before, the second half collapse issue was well and truly already in effect, especially if you just look 1 year prior to the Adelaide game that has been referenced. Additionally, the next 3 games, while we would go on to lose them in disappointing fashion, they were not losses due to specific second half fade-outs unless you want to count the Collingwood one, which again, I think is actually very reasonable. But even if you count the Collingwood one, it would only be 1 out of 3 games. To compare it to 2022, where down the stretch, through 15 games, there was 10 of those sorts of fade-outs, I think 1 and 3 is not necessarily a perfect indication of the trend that, Mr. McClure is trying to highlight. I wanted to cover this because, to me, so much of Sam McClure's analysis around Carlton, and not just him, seems to focus on this game against Adelaide, and specifically the decision to drop Jack Silvani, referring to this moment resulting in Carlton never being the same, and how much it has been used as an example of how standards were dropped, to me pollutes the coverage of Carlton in general, and specifically for the purpose that I'm trying to do today, which is determining when the trend of second half fade outs actually began. I hope I've done a sufficiently thorough job in demonstrating that I think Sam McClure's assertion that it occurred due to the round 20 game against Adelaide was flatly incorrect, as I have already demonstrated that it occurred in the year previous, and in addition to that, even if you wanted to say 2022 is where it started, it was not at the end of the season. That might just be me, though. To move forward to 2023, this is the best period of covering Carlton or following Carlton that anyone roughly my age has ever had. While 2023 started with Carlton's flakiness on full display, we all remember us getting over this issue from round 14 onwards. Through the first 13 games of the season, there were second half collapses of at least 12 points, or 4 of which occurred by 18 or more points. The issue didn't rear its head again, though, between rounds 14 and rounds 24. For those who don't recall, round 24 was when where Charlie Curnow had to kick 2 goals in order to win the Coleman. Myself and my dad went to that game, and the vibe in the stadium was essentially this. Charlie kicks his first goal, it's buzz everywhere. Charlie kicks his second goal and goes on to win the Coleman. The whole place loses it. There was a ridiculously large outpouring of emotion, which was actually really nice in fairness. But then the team kind of shut up shop for the rest of the game, and the Giants went on to sort of punish us on the way home. But, personally, I don't really look at that game as all that emblematic of anything, given, it was kind of meaningless. We couldn't get any higher on the ladder. We were kind of glued into 5th spot. So, the one more time it occurred in the home and away season, I think there was very valid reasons why it might have occurred. In addition to that, though, the elimination final against Sydney also involved a fade out where we won, and the preliminary final against Brisbane involved us having a large lead after kicking the first 5 goals of the game before going on to lose the entire game by 16 points. Just with note, with the Brisbane game, obviously the halftime margin was only 3 points, but we all remember getting out to a very big lead in that game as well. Even if you just take the very charitable 3-time halftime margin to suggest that the fall-off wasn't quite as big, it was obviously still a 19-point, margin destruction, if you will, between the first and second halves. From actually watching that game, though, my impression of the Lions prelim final was that really the better team just won on the day, but the Sydney game was worrying. The fade out was very clearly there. I don't think that you could say that despite having that lovely run at the second half of the season, that we were necessarily over the second half fade outs that we were experiencing. What you can see from round 14 on was really us just sort of belting teams. Like there's a period there, Gold Coast 59 points, Hawthorn 60, Freo 53, Port 50, West Coast 71. So we were just beating teams so comfortably that the question of whether or not we would collapse when put under pressure in the second half, I just think it wasn't really asked that much during this particular run. And while we did avoid fade outs, that does deserve some amount of credit. I think it was sort of that it just, the conditions to result in a fade out didn't occur as much because we didn't have as many games where we were sort of, hanging around at half time and then were badly challenged in the second half, resulting in the collapse or a fade out. Especially when you consider the start of the year, that the fade outs were still very much happening. I think that the sort of confidence and momentum that we bottled from round 14 onwards sort of inoculated us to it, but you can still see signs of it during the finals with that Sydney game. So I would contend that the issue that started in earnest in 2021 was still there definitely at the start of 2023, but then we did a good job of inoculating ourselves to it in the second half of the season. But it wasn't over. 2024 was a sort of funny season because I think most people would say that the reason why we didn't do as well as we would like was due to halftime fade outs that started in this season, particularly in the second half of the season. But that wasn't ever really my view. My view is that our overall standard dropped in the second half of the season. It wasn't due to second half collapses. There was just a bunch of games that we were never really in. We only had 5 second half collapses of 12 points or more. One of which was a game that we would go on to win anyway. This was many fewer than in 2023. Even though in 2023 we obviously had a more successful season, finishing higher on the ladder and also winning finals. While the fade-outs didn't start here in 2024, in my opinion, they were still consistently around, particularly down the stretch of the season. However, while 6 of our 8 last games were losses after comfortably having second position on the ladder in hand, only 6 of these games involved a second half collapse. So while we were losing a lot down the stretch, I've put the wrong title in, sorry. Only 3 of the games down the stretch from GWS onwards involved a second half collapse of the type that I am referring to. The rest were games that we just frankly didn't show up for. Like Bulldogs, down by 3 points at halftime, went on to lose by 14. Collingwood down by 13, manful effort to almost win, but still lost by 3. The Hawthorn game, we were down by 33 at halftime, went on to lose by 74. St Kilda in round 25, down by 10 at halftime. So these aren't captured as collapses because I think the damage was mainly just done in the first half. So while 2024 didn't have exactly the same problems that we were having previously, it does show that the issue was still hanging around and that the vulnerability of maybe being a team with some mental fragility was still doing the rounds before 2025, where it was well and truly back, unfortunately. I don't think anyone is arguing that the second half collapses started in 2025, but they were sure as shit on display here, particularly through the start of the season. An interesting thing to me is that more when these issues occurred throughout the season. It was at the start of the season, and this is what sort of half has turned me on to something else. I think that you can very clearly link when these run of collapses occur in each season. I think you can link them to specific pain points of the year, with one exception that I'll touch on shortly. 2018, the whole season was shit. We were under pressure the whole time because we just weren't good enough. 2019, at the start of the year, particularly before Bolton was sacked. Remember, we started 1-10 that year, including those collapses, including a collapse against Essendon, the game after which Brendan was fired. 2020, down the stretch of the season, to make finals for the first time in Teague's year was when the collapses reared their head in that season. 2021, down the stretch to make finals, and when Teague was ultimately let go. In other words, we had the pressure of trying to make finals and the pressure of having an under pressure coach in the eyes of the media, even though he had a year to go in his contract. Like I mentioned, there is a year that's the outlier, and it's 2022. This reaffirms to me, though, that it started in 2021, because when we had our fade-outs in 2022 was at the start of the season, the start of Michael Voss's tenure. This was not when we had the most pressure, because that was down the stretch, but it shows that we were still trying to work through the teething issues from the year before. Yes, we let ourselves down at the end of 2022 by not winning any of the last 4 games that we needed to make finals, but it wasn't necessarily due to the sort of issue that always plagued us. In 2023, the pressure was at the start of the year again, after missing finals the year before by a narrow margin. To me, it makes sense that the pressure would be at the beginning of the year before we were written off halfway through and then rattled on home to come 5th overall during the home and away season and eventually make a prelim. 2024, the collapses started occurring down the stretch. We were not under as much pressure at the start of 24. We were, though, when we were starting to gag coming top 4 after having secured a top 2 spot for the majority of the start of the season. And in 2025, this season here, there was so much pressure after how we finished 2024 with people expecting that we would go many better in 2025 than we did after fizzling out at the end of 2024. That is the end of the data-heavy analysis. So thank you so much for getting through it. My conclusions. With the exception of 2022, I think that it's obvious to see that all of these lapses occur mainly when the pressure is on. This shouldn't be a surprise. I am sure this would be the case for a lot of clubs, but definitely not all. Some do handle it better than we obviously do. We see clubs every year stand up well to pressure, but for some reason, and I've got some theories that we'll touch on in a minute, we don't. This isn't the video for me to talk about at length why I think this trend has developed, more just to try to pinpoint when it developed and, try to put some context around it. Additionally, given how many times I've said that I believe this issue largely came into full effect in 2021, I wanted to let you know some of the events that occurred at Carlton in 2021 that might have caused increased pressure at an organisational level that I think would transfer onto the, on-field performances. Financial. The club was under some financial stress, as most clubs were, due to the second year of COVID, and this was believed to be the major reason why we split our VFL program away from the Northern Blues. There was a handover in the presidency later in 2021 between Mark Lodjudice and Luke Sayers, following a mid-season internal review, the subject of which, that was subject to a lot of criticism because Carlton didn't publicly put the findings out. Teague got fired with a year to go on his deal and the general underperformance that was occurring. There were also people, both outside and inside the club, agitating for a board spill, with one particularly loudmouth fan regularly calling up SEN to embarrass himself repeatedly. I'm not going to say the fan's name. It was obviously linked directly to the board spill. I don't want to really give them attention because I'm close to certain that that's what they crave. But, you're welcome to do your own research. So my takeaway, this is a very BK Blues Kind show sort of takeaway. While I think we can make the obvious link between when our team's issues commenced with regard to second half collapses and the pressure surrounding the club, the reasons for this pressure are multifaceted and complex, so I think it would be dishonest to put it down to a specific reason. However, the fact that Carlton is as big as it is, and we have so many detractors from both inside and outside the Carlton family, it leads to an amplification that I don't think the club has done the best job in handling over the course of multiple regimes. However, I also feel a lot of the coverage is wildly unfair because I think that we're seen as easy pickings. So have we always handled it the best? Nah. But at the same time, can you judge someone for not handling something that they shouldn't be expected to handle? I have complicated feelings about that. So, the issue is not new. It didn't start in 2024, despite what some people have said. It didn't start as in 2022 either. I don't think the numbers could possibly support that as your take. So, if it did start in 2021, which is what I believe, how does this impact my view of how we should deal with it as a club going forward? On Michael Voss, Vossi obviously didn't cause this issue. He started in 2022, and I believe the problem was already there. But he also hasn't fixed it. I said in a previous video that I think Vossi's most important job this year is to create an environment whereby the festering problem can dissipate. If he does it, I think he'll keep his job. If he can't, it'll be up to the next head coach, unfortunately. On the club board and executive, again, the current brigade didn't cause this issue. I'll get to why I say that so certainly in a moment. Given people like Graham Wright and Rob Priestley are newer to the scene, they weren't even at the club in 2021, I don't think removing them this year is remotely helpful. They should get a chance to actually try and fix this problem. Additionally, the board in 2021 had 8 people. This include Mark Logedice, Luke Sayers, Jeannie Pratt, Chris Judd, Craig Matheson, Christopher Townsend, David Campbell, and Paddy Kinnersley. While Paddy Kinnersley, Chris Townsend, and David Campbell are all still at the club, the other 5 have been replaced, including by now President Rob Priestley, Greg Williams, Lara Carey, apologies Lara if I've mispronounced your name, Helen Kurincic, and Michael Byrne. So 5 of the 8 directors are now different, including the president, who is new altogether. He wasn't on the previous board. I think they deserve a chance to try to turn it around. What does this mean for the fans? I hate to say it, but probably that we need some patience and solidarity. I know a lot of you don't like that message, but I think with what I've tried to do of demonstrating when the problem began, who was actually at the seat of power during that time, and the fact that those same people are not currently at the club, I think that it is only fair to say that the people that were not there previously, who now have a chance to try to fix it, deserve a full chance to try to fix it. Hounding our own club has literally never helped. The same goes for the media. Leave us alone. If we are as shit as you say, why are you even bothering to cover us? Personally, I think it's a bit embarrassing to sit there and say Carlton sucks, but then, make us headline news over and over and over again. I'm not saying you can't talk about us at all, but I don't know. When I look at other codes, I don't see the worst teams in the leagues getting a hell of a lot of coverage. And if that's what you think of us, why aren't you covering someone else? Just a thought. To try to end on a lighter and more positive note, though, what I wanted to impress on is this. The changes in coaches, players, and even board level functioning in the last 5 years, particularly over the last year specifically, to me, gives enough suggestion that things could be different going forward in 2026. We need to work through these issues, obviously, but you can't have improvement without change. And we have changed a lot since 2021 when these problems commenced, and most notably since 2025 when we had a substantial turnover in the list, a substantial turnover in the coaching ranks, and hopefully a turnover in how our board deals with its issues. If you like what I'm doing, please give me a like or a subscribe. If you want to engage, push back, agree, disagree, give me some ideas, leave a comment, or shoot me an email at blueskindshow@gmail.com. Recently got some emails from audience members. Really made my day. So feel free to send more of them over. Thank you for watching. Thank you for those who stayed to the end through an hour-long video. It's greatly appreciated. Enjoy the bye round because it's a stress-free weekend. But most importantly, and as always, go Blues!